I can remember one of the first really important theological conversations I had ever had. And I was about 7 or 8 years old in my best friend's backyard on the street that I grew up in Grand Prairie. We hadn't yet turned into all suburbs, and we had horses and chickens and cows running around our street. And one day, my friend and I, Nathaniel, were bouncing on his trampoline out in his backyard right next to where the horses in his parents' land were. I can remember the heat of the Texas sun and the feel of that big trampoline under my feet before they had the bars and gates around them. And we were just talking. He and I were talking about how unfortunate it was that our good friend from school, who happened to be a young Muslim girl, wouldn't be going to heaven with us. She was really nice. She was great. She helped us out with our project. She was really fun to play with on the playground and in school. She was really intelligent and kind. But in my mindset at the time, that didn't really matter. And that was kind of the tone this conversation was in, bouncing up and down and the heat and the horses. And kind of the tone of this 8-year-old was, isn't that a shame? Let's go do something else with the rest of our day. I did feel at the time that something was wrong with that feeling. Something was wrong with both the feeling that I could think that was going to happen to somebody and just go on to get a popsicle, or, and more importantly, that someone who was so kind and generous and loving and bright and helpful and collaborative didn't have God's love the way I did. And I knew somewhere that just wasn't true. But that was our conversation, bouncing up and down. Rob Bell, in his book, Love Wins, that I read from today, describes that kind of tension, that kind of really question. It's the question, is that good news? That's what gospel means, good news. I was brought up in the church I was going to, being told to share the gospel, the good news. But his question, is that good news? And his more important question that I couldn't articulate as an 8-year-old or would never have thought to or felt permission to ask was, is that the best God can do? Does an unlimited God have a limited amount of love? And how did I get into the right club? What luck. Over the next 3 weeks, we in this church are going to be preaching sermons about who we are at our core. Because my guess is those of you in this room have felt that tension. Have asked yourself the question, is that the good news you have to share with me? Maybe you grew up in a tradition or were baptized or confirmed in a tradition in which you were told that God's love was limited. Or maybe, like both Reverends Dana and Cantor, you grew up in a Unitarian church and you were confused about the other traditions that were saying that. But there is something unique about our history. Rooted in a tradition that says there's no such thing as a stranger. No piece of creation, no person, no atom, no molecule will ever be separated from whatever we call God. For the next 3 weeks, we'll look at the origins and the basic beliefs of Unitarian Universalism, and today we're focusing more on Universalism. But our church came about because of the marriage of two progressive Protestant Christian denominations, the Unitarians and the Universalists. And we share a lot from that past, but they definitely wouldn't recognize a little of who we are today if we had a time machine. We come out of that tradition, like I said in the welcome today, we're a result of the progressive branch of the Jewish and Christian families, and we take their traditions and their rituals and their scriptures seriously, but not literally. We affirm that people encounter God in many ways, that all people are worthy of love and justice without exception, including you, and that religion isn't about what happens when you die, but rather how we build a more loving world right here and right now. Now, it looks like a church. That's because it is. And we've got pews and robes and stoles and hymnals and choirs. The way that I describe it to people in our Roots class is it's kind of like being the children of first-generation immigrants. If your family moved here from Spain and you were born here, you might speak Spanish. You might wear some Spanish clothes or celebrate Spanish holidays and holy days. You might eat Spanish food. But if someone said, "Oh, okay, you're not American," then you'd say, "Whoa, well, I can be both at the same time." That's kind of what it's like for us with our progressive Jewish and Christian parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. We wear their clothes, we sing their songs, we celebrate their holidays, we eat their food. So if someone said, "Oh, so you have nothing to do with progressive Christianity or Judaism," we'd say, "Well, that's not entirely true. We can do both. We grew up in a progressive Christian house and we married outside the faith." That's kind of who we are. Nothing's going to be a perfect analogy. That's kind of who we are. The Unitarians, who Reverend Cantor will talk about next week, I'm going to use some very inaccurate stereotypes to describe these two groups, but they're helpful. So if the Unitarians were the head, the Universalists were the heart. And starting around the late 1700s and early 1800s, particularly in the United States, this group of people began to assert that not only were people not born depraved, they were born good, holy. But the evidence of God's goodness was found in our use of reason. These were the Unitarians. They proclaimed that Jesus was a human, not God, that humans were good, not bad, that God was one, not three. And for them, salvation happened by character. You build a better life bit by bit. These are people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, John Adams, Abigail Adams, John Quincy Adams, kinda Thomas Jefferson. He wrote to a friend of his later in his life, in this country of free inquiry and belief, there's not a young man now living who will not die a Unitarian. He was totally wrong, completely wrong. But a lot of the founders of our country came out of a Unitarian church or mindset. They were, broad stereotypes, white, wealthy, urban, business owner liberals from Boston. The Universalists, on the other hand, were their rural, less educated, heart-filled cousins who went across the country preaching the love of a God so expansive that no person, no part of creation would ever be separated. In fact, they said, Gordon McKeeman, a famous Universalist of the early 20th century, described the end times as every last unrepentant sinner being dragged, kicking and screaming into heaven. You were predestined to heaven. You had no other choice. They would have tent revivals where they would preach, God loves you, there's nothing you can do about it, you're saved, go home. That's true. Texas was a hotbed of Universalism in the late 1800s. One of the things that I loved about the Universalists was that they really were, and again, broad stereotypes here, the country cousins of the urban Unitarians. They took pleasure in the fact that their ministers didn't go to fancy theological schools. They were really happy when people could talk off the cuff and make a quick, snappy remark to somebody else, kind of like the, well, if you were a Universalist, the idea would never occur to you to hurt me idea. In 1961, those two groups got married, Unitarians and the Universalists, to become Unitarian Universalism, what we have today. In the Roots class, I describe it, again, this is not going to be perfect. It's kind of like if Ruth Bader Ginsburg married Willie Nelson. So you've got your absolutely steel intelligence and reason, fighting for justice and compassion in the public sphere, and the guy who can go anywhere he wants and make friends and they'll love him. So if that works, keep that image in your head. In 1961, they became Unitarian Universalism, and so that's why we're here. But this church was in Dallas since 1899, as a Unitarian church first. Hosea Ballou, the guy that you heard about in the reading that Beth read this morning, was one of the most famous Universalist preachers in the country. He was the preacher at Second Universalist in Boston. And to show you the class differences between the Unitarians and the Universalists, he and William Ellery Channing, who our fellowship hall is named after, lived in Boston at the same time. Channing was the most famous Unitarian preacher in the world. Hosea Ballou, the most powerful and influential Universalist preacher in the world. Boston only has 30,000 people in the whole town. They're separated by about a mile, their churches. They never met. Because the class differences between Unitarians and Universalists were just that strong. Hosea Ballou came to be a Universalist by having the wrong emotional experience of God. He, as a young boy, maybe no older than I was on that trampoline, went to a revival service with his dad, who was a Baptist preacher. Now, those of you who were Baptist or Church of Christ, like me, will know that you don't end a service without an altar call. And they had an altar call. And so little Hosea went up to rededicate his life to Jesus. But he discovered something was wrong with him. He wasn't afraid of God. He was supposed to be God-fearing, and all he was God-loving. But he was told as a 7 or 8-year-old boy that that was the wrong emotion for God. You should be afraid. He would go on later to learn about Universalism through pamphlets and tracts, and his father didn't like it a bit. In fact, one day his father accused him, "Are you reading Universalist literature again, Hosea?" He showed him the Bible and said, "Yes, sir, I am." See, he was funny. He often referred to God as a loving parent, and his theology had that as the central metaphor. He would basically tell someone, "I don't need a fancy theological argument to get this over with. Do you have kids? Yes, sir, I do. Would you send them to hell for eternal torment? No, sir, I wouldn't. Are you God's kid? Mm-hmm. God won't do that to you." That was kind of his whole argument. He made a lifetime of a career based on that. In his book, A Treatise on Atonement, he said, in the relationship between God and human beings, God's not the dissatisfied party. In the relationship between God and humans, God's not the dissatisfied party. We are. He helped spread this idea of universalism until it became the 5th largest religion in the United States. The other Universalist whose story I love to hold up here in these Seeker series refresher sermons is George de Benneville. George de Benneville was a French Huguenot who was born in the early 1700s, and his family was being persecuted because of their faith. Luckily, his godmother was a queen, and so she took him under her tutelage and care. Turns out, though, George de Benneville was not a nice guy. And so when he was an adolescent, he was really hard to deal with, and all of his friends and family decided that he would be a lot easier to deal with on a boat a long way out in the ocean. So they put this teenager, George de Benneville, on a boat, sent him to the ocean on a merchant ship. And it was then that he came in relationship with Muslims for the first time. And he had an encounter that changed his understanding of race and religion forever. He had encountered black Muslims from Africa who in his language were called Moors at the time. And he saw that one of the men on the boat had injured his leg and was bleeding, and his compatriots were huddled over his leg, singing songs of prayer and putting their hands on his leg and crying into the wound to have the tears and the salt help. He had this moment where he thought, they are much better human beings than I am. Yet all my life I've been told that as a white Christian, I'm better and they're damned. This can't be true. He got so anxious about it that he thought it was the opposite, that now he was the one who was condemned. He went on to become a famous guerrilla Universalist preacher in the woods of France and Germany. He would hold these huge Universalist worship services in the woods at night under secrecy, which was illegal to do. He was sentenced to death at least 3 times, and a letter from a queen or king in a foreign government would release him at just the right time. He got really sick, so sick that his brother thought he was dead and built him a coffin. They laid his body in the coffin, and kind of like in a Monty Python skit, he just wasn't dead yet. But nobody else knew that. And so while George de Benneville was in his own coffin, he had a Dante Alighieri-style fever dream where God took him through all of the various levels of hell, and then purgatory, and then heaven. He got to meet Jesus and Adam and Eve and God. And then at the end, in this vision, God told him, all of these are merely symbols. All religions are true. All people, all races, all genders, all religions are absolutely equal. I love all people. Your job is to go back and preach this gospel for the rest of your life. So, in one of our very few Universalist miracle stories, George de Benneville got up out of his own coffin, became very popular, and went on to become an influential Universalist preacher here in what's now the United States. He moved when it was still the colonies. One of the big battles of the Revolutionary War happened on his land, and 2 British officers were killed. No one would bury these treasonous enemy soldiers on their land, and so they came to George de Benneville's farmhouse, and he thought about it and said, well, you know, when I died and God took me through a vision of hell, purgatory, and heaven and told me that all religions are mere symbols of a universal loving truth, you can just bury them at my house. And so if you go to his land today, you'll find 2 British enemy soldiers and de Benneville and his wife buried in their family plot. He would hold these revival services under his house where some of the first women preachers in the United States, where tribal leaders from native tribes would preach, and where people from all religions would be welcome to take the pulpit and preach. He was trying to build heaven on earth on his little plot of land. The Universalists would tell people, you better get to loving your enemies now because you're going to have to spend eternity with them in heaven. And there's George and the 2 enemy soldiers there forever. What I love about Hosea Ballou and George de Benneville and the primary kernel of the Universalist message is the whole point of religion isn't what you think it is. It's not what you've been told. The whole point of religion isn't to do the right thing or say the right prayer or make the right donation or be the right person so that God will love you. That's already done. In the relationship between God and humans, God's not the dissatisfied party. For Hosea Ballou and George de Benneville and others, our job isn't to make God love us. Our job is to fall in love with life and to have other people feel the love of an expansive God or universe because of their interactions with us. Our job is to build heaven on earth, not to get anywhere else. In the modern forms of this, for those of you who don't use the language of God, even in the modern forms that are most inspiring to me, it can still feel a little impersonal. So my guess is that if you're in this room, the idea of there not being a hell isn't exactly shocking. None of you have fainted yet. There may be a time in your life where that was a shocking message, where that felt like a weight was off your shoulders. It certainly was for me. But I didn't get up this morning and gather the children around the breakfast table and say, wake up, everybody, there's no hell. We kind of just came to that conclusion and moved on. I love the cosmic imagery for God. The idea that there is an expansive force that creates all life, which has recycled every atom in the universe over and over again. That you and I were all the same thing in the singularity, my one sermon. That idea is so absolutely inspirational to me, except my guess is that when you're sick, or when you made a big mistake that you think is going to threaten your job or your marriage, when you did something you wish you hadn't done, or the diagnosis has come in, when a friend of yours is ill or made a big mistake, or someone that you love dearly has died, if you came to someone and said, I'm struggling, and they said, oh, we're stardust, man, it probably wouldn't provide enough comfort. Being stardust and no hell might be cool, but it doesn't hit me personally. So for me, the challenge is not for us to all come here and agree that there's no hell. That would be super easy to do, and we did it a long time ago. The challenge for us in modern universalism is not to say, is there a hell or not, but if there's not, and there's not, if there's not, what are you going to do about it? What are you alive for? What feels like hell to you? Not to somebody else. What feels like hell? And are you willing to break it to pieces so that others might also be free? Is this a good idea? Or is this a radical change of lifestyle that will affect you forever? That's the modern universalist question. Like I said, I love the cosmic image. I love the idea that we're recycled, that each atom in our bodies used to be something else, and the universe is literally reusing everything and nothing is trash. That every atom has been retold over and over and over. That there's possibility pregnant in everything you've ever seen. But what I love even more is that that's true about you. You are being retold over and over and over. And if the universalists were right, and if the universe doesn't make trash and reuses everything, then God's not done with you. Ever. And if the language of God doesn't work with you, then your story isn't over yet. What universalism means to me is that the biggest mistake you ever made isn't the end of your story. Your addiction isn't the end of your story. Your loss isn't the end of the story. Your physical limitations are real, but they're not all of who you are. Every failure, every breakup, every moment you're not proud of isn't the end of your story. And a loving God is not done with you yet. Some of us kicking and screaming our way into heaven. So what are you going to do about it? What feels like hell? Are you willing to smash it to pieces? Because I promise you, once you drop the idea, and I mean really drop it, that somebody's more worthy than somebody else, once you stop playing the game of deciding who in your office is the most worthy of love, who in your marriage is truly worthy, who in your family or your city or your country, once you drop that calculus, all of a sudden, every moment becomes a conspiracy of possibility, and everyone you meet is your co-conspirator. But this only works in tangible, actual interactions with people. This doesn't work if it's an abstract idea. If we come here just to agree that there's no hell, it could lead to all sorts of hypocrisy and liberal self-righteousness, to someone walking through the door and going, well, those people keep talking about a loving God, but just aren't too lovable. It'll lead to somebody else saying, is that good news? Make it good news. In his book, Rob Bell asks, does love win? And it does, but only if you cooperate with it. It's like the difference between knowing a play exists and telling somebody about it, or reading the play and that being a little better, or going to the play and that being a little better, or being in the play and having written it and produced it and built it and directed it all together, because that's what you're doing. You're in love's play. And it won't win unless you say your lines, unless you cooperate with it. But watch what happens. I promise you. Watch what happens when you interact with every person in your life as if their story isn't over. Watch what happens when you look in the mirror and see a human being that God's not done with. Watch what happens when you convince yourself that nobody is irredeemable, not even you. See if that looks like heaven on earth. And then build it conversation by conversation, block by block, church by church, and life by life. We might only have this one. Amen.